Rowan Wilson, the first Black Chief Judge of the New York Court of Appeals. As a former Cravath partner of 25 years, Judge Wilson has mentored so many of us, and so I'm actually not quite sure how I got this lovely gig to introduce him today, but I'm very grateful because I owe my career to him. You see, Rowan hired me when I was in law school, and he assigned me to work for him for several years. And aside from my own parents, he shaped my life more than anyone else. It started off pretty rocky though. Rowan invited me within my first week to join him for a really important argument at the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. I knew nothing about the case, I hadn't worked on it, so I was practically useless to begin with. And Rowan invited me to tag along so that I could observe him. And I went with him to the subway so that we could go downtown. And as we walked down the subway stairs, I tripped on my own pant leg and fall. Like, not a graceful fall. Like, all the way down the stairs, tumbled, my shoe flew off. And there I am, beet red, and Rowan hands me my shoe. Which, it sounds like some sort of Cinderella story, like Rowan hands me my shoe. It was not. It was terrifying and embarrassing. And Rowan could have written me off right then, but that's not him. Instead, we made our way to the courthouse, and Rowan did this amazing Second Circuit argument. And on the way back to the office, he kindly said to me as we walked back into the subway to go back uptown, "Please hold the handrail." That was the beginning, and I've been fortunate that Rowan has been there for me since that day, gently guiding me and always there to pick up my shoe when I need it. And while my career began with Rowan, his began as a law clerk for Judge James Browning, who was then the Chief Judge of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. At that time, the Ninth Circuit was highly split ideologically, and even so, as Rowan tells it, everyone loved Judge Browning. He treated everyone the same, his fellow judges, the litigants, the court staff, and strangers. To hear Rowan speak about Judge Browning is pretty striking because he embodies precisely those same values and has throughout his career. At Cravath, Rowan led incredibly complex litigations, and he also dedicated much of his time to pro bono work. One of the cases of which he's particularly proud, and rightfully so, is a series of class actions to stop race and gender discrimination in Alabama's hiring and promotional practices. Rowan devoted decades to these lawsuits, and I was lucky enough to work with him for a short time on those, including a trial against the county for contempt of its consent decree. Rowan brilliantly presented the case in the courtroom, but what happened outside the courtroom was just as memorable. There was this man who was waiting outside the front entrance every day. He had a car filled with what looked like junk, scrap metal, and some handwritten signs. And rather than ignore him or pass him by, Rowan walked right up. Over the course of that trial, he learned about this man's life in small discussions each morning. And on the last day of trial, they both coincidentally showed up with gifts for each other. That man gave Rowan a signed copy of his book. It turned out that this man was a sculpture artist. His name is Joe Minter, and his work has since been featured at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Smithsonian. Rowan didn't hurry past or ignore him, as many others did. He slowed down and greeted him, treated him with immense kindness and respect. Now, when Rowan first became a judge on the New York Court of Appeals, he put together a list of qualities he was looking for in his law clerks. The first and last requirements were kindness. Pretty much everything else he figured he could teach. Rowan did say that his law clerks needed to be interested in writing, and he clarified that was different from being a good writer. He was willing to teach them to write, but they needed to be kind and be interested. And as a judge, he and his law clerks have certainly written a whole lot of opinions and a lot of dissents. And the fact that Judge Wilson can so frequently disagree with his colleagues and still be trusted to lead them speaks volumes about his integrity, kindness, and respect for others. I have no doubt that he'll unite New York's highest court the same way that Judge Browning did for the Ninth Circuit. So I'm incredibly thrilled for the state of New York to have Rowan Wilson as the Chief Judge, and I'm thrilled for you all to have the opportunity to hear directly from him today in an insightful discussion with Carl Forbes.
This thing does not want to stay on. Thank you, Lauren. Judge, appreciate you being here with us this evening. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So let's jump right into it.
Absolutely, it's great. And thank you, Laura.
All right, so April 18th of this year, you're confirmed as Chief Judge, a historic confirmation. What does it mean to you to be the first Black Chief Judge in New York State?
It's a hard thing to think about, because when you ask, what does it mean to you? I've never really taken any job that I've had because of what it means to me. It's really always been what it means to others. The others could be my family, the others could be the community at large, other people I work with, clients, people in New York. But, although that's a hard thing to think about, it's an important thing to think about, because I certainly, I grew up in California. I grew up in Northern California with a family that was quite socially conscious, and we listened to sort of counterculture news when I was growing up. And there were, many people who were important to me that I didn't know, Dr. King, Malcolm X, others, who, let you see that things were changing, and they were changing because of their efforts. And so, as I realized those people were important to me, although it's, I have a pretty small ego. I have to, at some point, recognize that, my status as the first Chief Judge of color in the state of New York probably means things to other people. It maybe means big things to other people, and that I shouldn't downplay that.
I mean, I've said it's inspirational, right? And so it definitely means something to others, especially us at MBBA and what we look to do here in the state on behalf of the bench and the bar. And so, talk a bit more about growing up in Northern California in the 60s and 70s. What was your adolescence like? How did it shape you?
So there was an interesting change. I was born in Southern California in kind of a sleepy area outside of Los Angeles, Pomona, and we moved when I was 7, and the way I've often described it was like the Wizard of Oz, where Dorothy opens the door in Oz and everything is Technicolor all of a sudden, because this was Berkeley, California in 1968, free speech movement, anti-war movement. Almost every stop sign in Berkeley had the word Nixon under it at some point. And the city council elections were not between the Republicans and Democrats. They were between the ABC, the All Berkeley Citizens, and the BCA, Berkeley Citizens Action. One of them was the socialists and the other was the communists, and I could never keep straight which was which, but one or the other always won the city council and the mayoral races. It was, it declared itself a nuclear-free city at some point. I don't even know if you can do that, but it did. It was a very interesting place to grow up, and it was, just when I got there, Berkeley voluntarily decided it was going to desegregate its schools, and it did it in a creative way. It took all of the schools that were K through 6 schools and cut them into either K through 3 or 4 through 6, and distributed those schools because Berkeley was sort of racially and socioeconomically segregated. The farther north and east you went, up into the hills, the whiter it got, and the further south and west it was blacker and also then Latino. And so they distributed the schools in such a way that you might go, and then they did the same with the well, I'll get to that in a minute. So you might go to the close by K through 3 school, but then you were going to get bused because there was no 4 through 6 school near you. So, and then they were busing kids into the K through 3 schools. For 7 and 8, they cut down the 3 middle schools into 2, and they did it on an axis so that it was north-south, and so it was integrated automatically. They moved all the 9th graders into a single school, so that was completely integrated, and then a single high school. So it was way ahead of its time in terms of getting people from different places, different cultures, ethnicities. And it was a place that also had, a significant Latinx and a significant Asian, and not just East Asian. population at the time. So it was really, in a lot of ways, the sort of melting pot that the United States at large pays lip service to. But it was a very interesting place to grow up.
That's the word that came, or phrase, melting pot, that came to mind. And so we like to think as New Yorkers we're in the biggest melting pot. So I'm going to move around a little. You end up in New York. How does that happen?
Well, that's a couple of things, I guess. One is that at the time I was finishing my clerkship, I still thought that what I wanted to do was to be a law professor. But I thought that the professors I'd had who'd had some practical experience, whether they had been in practice or they took cases on the side, were better, because the law is not just a purely theoretical exercise. It really is what we all sort of live by, and people have legal problems, and that's what animates the law. And so I thought that practicing somewhere would make me a better professor. Legal jobs as professors, if you're lucky to get one, it could be anywhere in the country. So coming to New York wasn't really a disadvantage in any way. And I thought that the best litigation firm in the country and the place where I could get the most experience the fastest was Cravath. And even with 3 or so weeks left in my clerkship, I hadn't made a formal decision. And I got 2 calls in sort of rapid succession. One from the head of the litigation department here, who said, what are you going to do? And I said, well, I'm not sure yet. And he said, well, if you come here, you can be assigned to me, and if you start by September 2, you'll travel to Japan. I'd never really been out of the country before, so I thought that was kind of attractive. And I admired the guy who called me. He was really the best trial lawyer I've ever seen. And shortly, within a few hours, I got a call from the hiring partner at another firm that I'd been at in Washington, D.C., with whom I'd worked extensively, and had a very different approach. It was, hi, we'd really love to have you come here. Is there anything we do to help you? Anything you want to know? And I said, yeah, you could tell me, here's my choice, and what would you do? And he said, I would go to Cravath. He said, it's a one-of-a-kind place, and if you end up liking it, you would have done yourself a disservice not to have tried it. And if you end up not liking it, whether that's 6 months or 6 years later, you can come here, you can go to any other firm in the country, and nobody asks any questions. I thought, well, that is probably advice that's against his interest. I wasn't sure. He could have been trying to get rid of me, but that's how I wound up here.
Okay. Let's back up. So you wanted to be a law professor, law school-wise, but what about as a child? Growing up in California, what you described for us, what were you thinking at that time?
Sure, as a little child, I loved building things, and I still do. I still love fixing things and building things. There's a lot of stuff I can repair or build still, including cars and other kind of stuff. So I thought I wanted to be an architect, and then I found out I could not draw. Still can't draw. I cannot even write script. My signature is unintelligible. So that was out. So then I thought, after a little bit, well, I'd like to be a doctor. I thought that for a while until in between 7th and 8th grade, the Latin teacher in my middle school knew that I wanted to be a doctor, and so he took me on I think it was a Saturday, to the University of San Francisco Medical School, and it was the human gross anatomy lab for third-year students, and they were cutting open cadavers with rotary saws. And I still remember the smell. And that was the end of being a doctor.
Lauren, he doesn't remember your story, but he remembers the smell from childhood. Okay. So how did we come around to law school then?
Well, law school is a bit later. So when I was in 9th grade, my English class had 20% of the grade was based on an oral report. And I completely freaked out. I was a quiet kid. I did my homework, but I didn't speak in class unless I was called on. And so I didn't want to do it. And so my 9th grade teacher, remember 9th grade is all by itself, so I was never going to see this guy after 9th grade, but he said, I'll tell you what, I'll excuse you from it if you spend the summer between 9th and 10th grade figuring out why you wouldn't do this and what you're going to do about it. And come back and see me, before 10th grade starts, when I'm setting up my classroom for 9th grade. I would have taken any deal, so I took it. And but I liked him a lot, and I respected him. And I went back, and I said, I thought about it all summer, and I was afraid of speaking in public because I thought people would think, make fun of me or think that what I was saying was stupid or something like that, and I realized that's not rational. And so what I've decided to do is to join the speech and debate team at the high school, which I did. And it was nerve-wracking for about 10 minutes, and then it was enervating, and I really liked it, and I was doing pretty well at it. Really rapidly. And so then I did as much public speaking, impromptu speaking, extemporaneous speaking, Model UN, YMCA Youth in Government. Every chance, I was really hardly in high school. I was really mostly traveling around speaking. And so it's somewhere in there, and because the debate topics particularly, but also the Youth in Government program, were very public policy focused, I really thought, I wasn't still thinking about being a lawyer. I didn't know any lawyers, but I thought that going to law school would be a great resource in whatever I wanted to do in the way of public policy or government service. So that's kind of what got me that way. And partly it was that I was finishing up college, and it just seemed like a lot easier to take a test and fill out some papers than to try and get a job.
Okay. Not quite at your level, but I did Junior Statesman of America in high school and got to go to DC and debate a bit, and so understand it a little bit. Let's talk about your career journey a bit. What are some of the key experiences you recall that prepared you for Cravath and partnership? Your leadership in various charitable and nonprofit organizations, and now your current role leading the state's highest court.
That's a big question. So the thing that I think I learned a lot more from my clerkship with Chief Judge Browning than I did in law school. And part of it was just maturation and understanding what it was to have. You clerk for a judge and you're drafting an opinion, that if it's a majority opinion, that's going to be the law. And the care that's required, and it's different from, I used to work at a used record store buying records. If I overpaid for a used record or underpaid for it, But you make a mistake in something that's the law, that's pretty tough. And I remember a lot of different things that I learned, and I could give you many instances of things where I thought I had done a good job and it turned out I hadn't. But that learning process, and also learning how to relate to people and even people who disagreed with you, was really, I think, very formative for me. And Judge Browning remained a really good friend of mine until he passed away. I many years later would take my kids over to see him when we were in San Francisco. He came to my dad's 80th birthday party. He was just a wonderful person. I was the only person who was not a judge or a relative to speak at his memorial service at the court at the Ninth Circuit. So that was very important. And then really coming here and being assigned to Tom Barr and working for Tom Barr, the head of the litigation department, for a couple of years, he took, I think, very great care of me. It was, I think, important for when I started, I should say it this way, when I accepted here, there were no African American attorneys. It turned out there were 5 of us who came in at the same time, but I didn't know any of the others because I clerked for 2 years, and so they weren't in my summer program, and nobody told me they were starting. They were all great. One of them is, next week we have training sessions for all the judges in the state, basically. Next week we're doing 400, and then in July another 400. And I'm leading a panel on the Court of Appeals civil case decisions, and one of the people on my panel is one of the women who started Cravath the same time I did. She's now a partner at Faegre, Sandy Granum. But so part of it was, a big part of it also was just somebody really taking care of my development, care in what I was working on, care of what I was placed on. Tom Barr had I see Rich looking at me, Clary over there, who worked with Tom a great deal. Tom had a reputation, he was an ex-Marine, if anybody's ever ex-Marine, maybe he's a Marine. And he had a reputation of being pretty tough. I messed something up. I remember exactly what it was. And it was at a trial. And instead of yelling at me, he sort of called me aside and walked me down the hallway in the courtroom in Tucson. and put his arm around me and said, this doesn't seem like a very big thing, and it's really not, but you're now the senior associate on this team, and everybody's going to look up to you, and so even little mistakes get amplified, and you have to be more careful. And I pinned the thing that was the mistake up to my board in my office for years. But just like my English teacher who waived the assignment, I think people understanding me as a person and taking care of me as a person and being interested in my development made a huge difference.
So I've heard that a lot, that theme about people taking care, the way you've talked about Judge Browning and Tom Barr, and Lauren mentioned in you looking for clerks, kindness being a thing. So talk more about that. Why is that important? I think we have a group of summer associates here, young attorneys, MBBA membership, and senior attorneys who might need some lessons in how to have a softer touch. So talk a bit more about why that's important and how people might be able to embrace that.
Well, let me start it a little bit backwards. So I sit with the same 6 other judges when we decide cases all the time, and we disagree about a variety of things. And imagine how hellish it would be if we were angry with each other all the time, if we called each other names, if we couldn't get over the fact that somebody didn't see things your way, even when you're absolutely convinced you're right, which I am all the time. Life would be unbearable that way. So you need to separate ideas and arguments from people, and you need to respect people regardless of what views they have about things, and treat them as human beings. And the fundamental thing there, I think, is kindness, is treat people kindly. You don't need to shout at people. You can get a lot more done by treating them with respect and with kindness. And I've found that's always worked better for me than I don't yell at people. I think there is nobody, I'm sure there's nobody here who's ever heard me utter a curse word of any kind. It's just, and I'm not saying that means, if you do, that means you're a bad person or anything like that. But, the civility matters a lot, I think.
I've often said that, and using the word civility brought to mind when I was an adjunct professor and speaking with students. I've always said, and even before speaking with students, always said that just because your clients are adversaries doesn't mean you have to be, right? At the end of the day, you may end up as co-counsel or working together in other ways, and if you're that person who's not civil, and then you end up, it becomes very awkward. And so hopefully that lesson ends up carrying often and hearing that. So in talking about kindness and what you're looking for, there's been a lot of talk more recently, or acknowledgement of people of color bringing their whole self to work and being authentic. So how do you do that, especially thinking about some restrictions that judges may have and the things you can say or do?
Well, those are having now being a judge, I really have to be careful. There are ethical rules that prevent me from doing certain things and allow me to do others. And so I have to be I have to make sure I know what those are, and I have to not get too close to the line. But you can still be authentic, I think, even with those constraints in place. And it's really just being yourself. And I can tell you a story about, for some of you who are summer associates or very young associates, that will not embarrass Rich Clary too badly. But I'd been at the firm for, I think, 4 months, and Bob Barron is actually involved in this story too, wherever Bob is. I'd been at the firm maybe 4 months or so, and I was tasked with writing a couple of appellate briefs for Rich, with whom I was working. And Bob was then the senior associate on the team, and I had already gotten approval, months ahead of time to go back to California for Christmas break. But the briefs were due, my recollection is, sometime in sort of mid to late January. And so Bob came to me and said, you really should postpone your vacation, get the briefs done first and then go after the briefs are filed. And I said, thanks for the advice. And I went to Rich and I said, here's what Bob told me. And I checked the law library hours at UC Berkeley. And my parents lived 6 blocks from there. And they're going to be open, and I'll be able to get the briefs to you on the schedule you wanted, and I'll send them to the firm by modem. Remember, this is a really long. This is This is 1986, 87, right? End of 1986. And Rich says, "What's a modem?" And I said, "Well, it's a device where I can send the documents back to Cravath electronically from California." And he said, "Sort of like a fax?" I said, "No, it's actually the document will come and they'll be able to put it on a floppy disk and hand it to you." And floppy disk also tells you how long ago this is. And he said, "Are you sure this is, do we have any of these?" And I said, "Yeah, we've got 2 of them in the data processing department." And he said, "Are you sure this is gonna work?" I said, "Yeah, I'm sure it's gonna work." And he said, "Fine." And I went home, and I was home, but I did work at the law school library, and I wrote the briefs, and I sent the drafts off to Rich, and everything was fine. And that's being my authentic self. It was important to me to get my work done properly. It was important to me to meet those responsibilities. But it was important to me to spend the time with my family. And I would encourage everybody to be yourself. If whatever place you're working doesn't accept you for who you are, there's plenty of places that will. It might take a little work to find them, but they're there.
So, talking about more about you and your authentic self, we heard about dissents, right? Talk to us about that.
Well, I think everybody in my family, and now I disagree with this, but this also fits with what we're about to talk about. Everybody in my family would say that I'm the most stubborn person in my family. And part of that is that I have pretty strong views about things, and I'm open to listening to other ideas, and I like being shown that I'm wrong, but I'm not often wrong. And the law is important to me, and people are important to me. And I think if you read through most of mine, and there's some dissents that are on procedural issues that nobody really cares about. But most of them, I think, if you read through them, what I care about is people. And I care about how people are being treated. And if you read and I always try to tell a story in the dissents to the extent possible, and to make it a story that grabs you at the beginning, that's engaging, because who's going to read a dissent otherwise? It's not the law, so why are you reading it in the first place? But what I care about is how people are being treated by the system, whether the system is a system of laws for contracts or torts, or the system is the criminal justice system. It's where it seems to me there is some unfairness that I sort of get animated to write a dissent. And part of the reason, I don't mean this in a defensive way, that I've written so many dissents is just by virtue of where my seat was at the Court of Appeals, because we sit in a round table and the dissents are a function of where you sit and who's sitting on your left. And there for a long period of time were a lot of people sitting, 3 judges in a row sitting on my left who typically agreed with each other and didn't agree with me. So if any one of them had the majority writing, I was going to pick up the dissent because I was sort of the next person as you go around the circle. One of the things I didn't realize when I applied for this job, and didn't really realize until after I got it and then sat, is that my seat changed, and because my seat changed, I'm now going to have many fewer opportunities to dissent, because the person on the court with whom I tend to agree most is Judge Rivera, and she is directly on my left now. So she's going to pick up all the dissents, and unless I disagree with her, my opportunities are pretty limited. I'm not sure I would have applied for the job if I realized that.
Don't say that.
But, yeah, okay.
Because I think we're all happy you did. And so, but talking about that, so it's been a little over 2 months. What has it been like?
So, it's been interesting. The court session ended, we had our last arguments in May, and the court, we handed down all the opinions. We finished with them by June 9. So I've been able to spend a lot of time now on the other stuff, which is sort of administration of the courts. But just saying those words doesn't really give you a full idea of what this is about. So, for example, I got a call probably a month ago now from the director of Indigent Legal Services, and which I sort of vaguely knew existed, but I didn't really know what it did. I didn't know it had $500 million that it distributes every year for indigent legal services around the state. And I didn't know that the chief judge is the chair of its board and appoints some of its members. There's also the Justice Task Force. It doesn't have that much money, but it's very important in terms of looking at justice issues. And it turns out I appoint everybody to the Justice Task Force, and I chair the board meetings. So there are all sorts of things like that. Then there's things like today. So probably a month ago or so, a group called the Right to Counsel Coalition, which is concerned about tenants who are unrepresented. The city passed legislation entitling everybody to counsel if they meet a certain low income threshold, and has not really been able to provide that. And so they're quite upset about that. They have demonstrations and so on. And they sort of lobbed in a letter to me saying, we'd like to meet with you, I think fully expecting that no chief judge ever would. And they were in my office today for about an hour and a half with some of the judges who were responsible for the housing courts in the city. I don't think they left completely satisfied, but I think they left at least thankful that they were heard and impressed that that we're thinking about how to help. And they're, before that, in the middle of the day, I was at the dedication ceremony for the Queens Criminal Court high-tech courtroom, where, all these things, even if I'm told I don't have to speak, I end up having to speak. This one I was told I had to speak, and so I thought, well, okay, I've got an idea. And the idea was to have ChatGPT write my speech, because it's a high-tech courtroom, and I could give a high-tech address and then have the reveal at the end. And it was not a very good speech. So there's a lot. Yeah. There's a lot. But I am trying, and the chief administrative judge whom I appointed, Josias, is also, he's everywhere. Judge Richardson Mendelson is everywhere that either of us is at. She's everywhere around the state. And we have a great team in place and are trying our best to improve the court system.
So speaking of trying and working together as a team, what do you see right now as the greatest challenge for the unified court system, and how are you looking to address it?
So there are a few, I think. Probably the biggest and has been most persistent is family court. We need more resources in family court. I mean, it's a great thing that just very recently the 18B lawyers who work in family court were, for the first time in 20 years, given a raise. They've been paid $70 an hour or something like that, and now it's up to $158. So that helps a lot. But the providers who also, institutional providers have not gotten commensurate amounts of money. It's very hard to find enough judges and enough lawyers in family court. And then, as somebody who tried cases, civil cases in a commercial context, even if you watch TV, a trial starts one day and it continues until it finishes, and you don't take breaks, really. That's not what happens in family court. You have an hour today, and then maybe 3 weeks from now you have another hour, and then 6 weeks later you have 2 hours. And so a trial about whether a child should be removed from his or her home and put into foster care, or the parents should lose their parental rights, could take 15 months from start to finish, with really only maybe 10 or 20 hours of trial testimony. And meanwhile, the child is aging. And then whenever you get a decision out of the family court, then that gets appealed, and so the child is still aging. And by the time my court gets a leave application, it could be 3 or 4 years after whatever the decision was made, and the child is now much older. Sometimes we get leave applications where the child is aged out of the system. They're now over 18, and they're no longer a child, and we dismiss the application because it's moot. So there are a lot of problems there. Housing court right now is a problem. That's partly pandemic related, because there was essentially a stay, nobody could be evicted, and now there's a lot of motion to try and evict people, and the legal service providers are not fully equipped to provide counsel. And I think, but despite those things, I guess what I have been saying, what I do believe, is that for the unified court system right now, job one is morale. Because my understanding, and talking to lots of people, is that morale has been pretty low, and I'd like to do things to here's the way I'd say it, I guess. Many of the judges, maybe most of the judges in the system, perceive that the Office of Court Administration, which is sort of this administrative bureaucracy, thinks that the judges work for them, work for the bureaucracy. And I think, and Judge Zayas thinks, and others think, that OCA needs to work for the judges. And so delivering that message and implementing that message, I think, in some ways is the most important thing we could do, because we have the resources we have, And those resources can do a lot more if they're treated with kindness and respect than if they're dictated to.
What can bar associations and practitioners do to support that?
I think they can do a lot. I mean, one of the things that we're trying to do also is to meet with bar associations, not just here, but around the state, to travel. And they can, there's many things. So for example, bar associations encouraging law students to think about family law. Bar associations doing outreach to we have a shortage of court reporters, so to convince people that being a court reporter is a great career. There are lots of sort of outreach type activities of bar associations that thinking about the needs of the courts, where they're in the communities, they can work with the communities, and they can help drive resources we need to places we need them. They can also, for example, bar associations right now could step in and help with the housing court representation crisis in the city. Some cases are very complex, but some are not. Many, I've sat and watched housing court, and a lot of times it's really just a negotiation. And if where a tenant is unrepresented and doesn't know how to negotiate and has not even any conception about rights, any lawyer is going to do a perfectly good job helping in the mine run of cases. Not in the most difficult ones perhaps, but bar associations law. What I used to tell people here about pro bono work when somebody would say, "I'm really not sure if I can do this, or if I know enough. It's not an area of law I know about. What if I screw this up?" What I would say is, well, think about what is going to happen to the person if you don't represent that person. Then they're going to be on their own. Are you telling me that you've been to 3 years of law school and you've been here for a year and a half and you're going to do a worse job than this poor person who's probably never even gone to college? Is that what you're telling me? And you get a sheepish look, and then the person would sign up and they'd have a great experience. They'd realize they helped somebody, and then they would do it over and over.
A few more minutes before we open to some Q&A from the audience. Move to a bit lighter questions. Well, one, what advice would you give someone who wants to follow in your footsteps?
Don't.
I literally was about to say, I knew that's how you were going to answer. Please don't say don't.
I think so. What I think makes people good at anything that they do is loving what they do. So the first advice I would give you is, don't come with a preconception about here's what I'm going to be. Try something out that seems interesting to you, and if it really works, that's great. If it doesn't, don't stick with it. It's a sunk cost, and it's gone. Move on to something else. Try to make a good decision about what the next thing is. But if that doesn't work, keep trying until you find something where, I don't have an alarm clock. I haven't had an alarm clock. I don't have anything by my bed to wake me up in the morning, and I haven't for years and years and years and years. Really never. Why? Because I wake up thinking about all the great things I have to do, and I want to do them, and that's what gets me out of bed. If you need to find something like that, where you don't think of your job as work, you think of it as fun. And then it's really easy. So my footsteps, sort of broadly painted, are not being chief judge of the state of New York, but being someone who just has always loved the work that he's done, whether it was being a law clerk for Judge Browning, working here for 30 years plus, being an associate judge of the court, and being, verdict is out on chief judge, but I still don't have an alarm clock.
I love my job in running MBBA, but I'm not a morning person, so I have to figure out maybe one day how to exist without an alarm clock. I'll ask you after to teach me the ways. So you're 25 years old, you're ambitious. Knowing everything you know now, what would you tell yourself?
It's funny. My wife once, we were in an exercise where we were being asked to describe each other's characteristics, and she said ambitious about me. And I have never thought of myself that way. I think of myself as contented, happy, helpful. But it's not a word I would ever use to describe me. But usually when my wife and I disagree about something, she's right. So,
The one place where you're not always right.
yes. Which is more than one time, but it is one place. So give me your question. Yeah, I'm sorry. So 25-year-old me, ambitious.
Everything you know now, what do you tell yourself?
Oh, I don't, there's really if that question is sort of like, what would you do differently? I guess, the thing I would tell myself is, you're going to be really happy. You're going to have a really happy life. But the only thing that I've ever thought of that, gee, if I could have done this differently, I would do differently, is I raced through school, and I shouldn't have done that. I should have taken a year, and I have explanations for why I did and so on, but in hindsight, I would have just gotten a lot more out of everything by taking a year off, 2 years off, even if it meant, going to Paris and washing dishes for a year, somewhere in there. So that's the one real regret I have.
That happiness piece is key. I think that a lot of us would say that life works out, right? If you have a plan or you don't, life comes together, and so focus on those moments that you just talked about, maybe slowing down and not racing through and trying to just accomplish everything in one fell swoop. So, okay. A couple lightning round questions.
Yep.
And what comes to mind? Your favorite thing to do to unwind? A weekend, you're not in the court. What's that top thing?
Reading fiction.
Give us one piece of fiction that either you read recently or stands out in your mind.
I'll give you two. Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison, and The Mill and the Floss by George Eliot.
Okay. Tony's my favorite author, so again, great connections. Speaking of artists, authors, what's your go-to motivational or feel-good song?
I love music. This is supposed to be lightning round, right? Sorry.
That's all. Listen, please. We're always happy to have you expelled.
So I have different things for different moods and different needs. But if I had to pick one, I would say Earth, Wind & Fire, Shining Star.
Okay. One thing you do for self-care?
Go to the gym every morning.
Again, something I gotta become like him about. The mornings are your time, clearly. And so,
no, I'm very flexible about. I can stay up till 3 or 4 and then wake up at 10 or 11 and have that as a regular schedule, or I can go to bed at midnight and wake up at 5 as a regular schedule. It doesn't matter to me as long as it's relatively regular.
Okay. There's one thing you want the audience to remember about our conversation today. What would it be?
That I'm really delighted to see so many people here. Some I know, some I don't know, some I've known forever. But it's just great.
And it's been great speaking with you and having you. And so I'm going to open to the audience for a few questions before. And yes. Thank you, Judge, for that wonderful conversation. And so before we move into our networking reception, are there any questions from the floor, please? Do we have mics? So there are mics, so if you raise your hand, that would be great. There's got to be a question out there. There we go.
Hi, I'm Jezebel. Thank you for speaking with us. I'm not sure if your memory will serve you right, so that's okay, but what would your 8-year-old self think of you now?
My 8-year-old self was worried because my dad had just had a stroke, and he was separated from us for about 6 months while he was in rehab in Southern California while we were in Northern California. And he was 15 years older than my mom. And so my 8-year-old self was kind of worried, quite worried about what the future was going to be. So my 8-year-old self now would think, wow, everything worked out pretty well. I shouldn't have worried so much.
Thank you.
Are you an only child?
No, I've got two younger siblings. I've got a younger brother and a younger sister.
Couldn't wait for the minute.
Yeah.
Good morning, good evening, good night. I'm rusty at historical additives. However, I did want to ask a question about, some years ago I saw a documentary about Adam Clayton Powell, and he conducted a court proceeding in Harlem for the general public. Do you recollect the incident?
I don't.
Adam Clayton Powell?
Well, yeah, of course I've heard that.
Antics.
Yes. Yes.
Well, if you could visualize then, would you care to comment about what the effects of the incident? He conducted court proceedings on 125th Street, general public, for the community as an educational experience. In what context, in the spirit of Juneteenth, would the episode mean if repeated?
So I don't know of the episode. It's now, of course, as somebody who loves history, I've got to go back and find out about it.
However, it's historical fact.
Yeah. Yep.
I don't have any exact dates
Yep. No. So
regarding educating the general public, the community.
yes. No. Absolutely. So one of the things that we have been trying to do is to educate the community, and so I gave one of the keynote speeches on Law Day this year at the Court of Appeals, and the Attorney General gave another one, and the President of the State Bar gave one. And my point was that civics education is tremendously important, and that's in some ways the thing that we have most lost here. And this again goes back to getting along with people who have different points of view. Is we seem the lack of civic education, and there's lots of metrics that show that fall off, has contributed to a lot of the polarization here. And that more civics education, and that would be an example of civics education, it would be an important thing for all of us. About a week ago, I guess, when I was giving a speech for the court systems Franklin Williams Commission, which is a long story to explain what that is. But I was giving a speech about the Reconstruction Amendments. As soon as I finished at the lunch break, I then by video joined the finals of the Bronx courts run a program for middle school students, a mock trial program. And so I joined that by video to sort of talk to them a little bit about the importance of civic education and what they were doing. So all these sorts of things that bring the courts to the public, I think, are wonderful and very important.
Good evening, Judge. How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
I have two questions, if you don't mind.
Of course not.
So the first question is, what do you wish you knew before you became an attorney? And my second question is, what was your most impactful case or experience as a judge?
So what I wish I knew before I became an attorney, I guess, would just be how much I really enjoyed being an attorney. Because remember, I was thinking of being a law professor and not practicing for very long, and it turned out, I was here for 30 years. I loved what I was doing. And I wish I'd known that ahead of time. Not to say I wouldn't have loved being a law professor, but the job here was great. My favorite, was that the question?
Most impactful,
Most impactful
case or experience as a judge.
Well, there are an awful lot of dissents. And so it's hard to know whether dissents are impactful. I can point to some where the legislature then stepped in and reversed the majority, but for dissents, it's very hard to know what the impact is until many, many years have gone by, because what happens to really good dissents is they become the majority much later. And I'm holding out hope that several of them will have that fate. For a majority opinion, I really like the dissents. and probably there is an answer I could give you, but I shouldn't.
You might have to turn the cameras off for that. Ask him later during the networking.
It might come. It's an issue that might come back around sooner than later, and so I need to stay away from that.
Hello, Judge. Thank you so much for coming and speaking to us and sharing your insights. My name is Jill Pilgrim. I'm a long-time on-again, off-again member of the MBBA. I know I
And leader.
my dues. I'm also chair-elect of the New York State Bar's dispute resolution section. And we're having quite a time getting big firms like Cravath with big cases to consider appointing as mediators women and people of color, even very, very well qualified women and people of color. How might you address that or assist us in addressing that?
So that's a good thing for me and others to raise when we meet with bar associations, particularly the New York City Bar, the New York State Bar. I'm glad you raised that. I didn't know that was true, but now I do. And there are plenty of people in this room, looking at Judge Richardson Mendelson, who will assist me in making that point. And there's some partners from Cravath here who heard you.
Point them out.
They're the ones leaving for the door, right? I'm kidding.
Hi, my name is George Smith. I'm second year corporate associate here at Cravath, and I'm one of the co-leads of our African American Black Affinity group. Thank you for coming. This being, you as the first Black partner here at the firm. Like, not that we idolize you or anything, but we definitely look up to you for the path that you've laid out for us. Given how unique the Cravath experience is, we'd love to get your thoughts as to, like what advice you would give to us if you could go back and do it differently, what you got from this place that continues to inform your career, and just like generally, what advice would you give us?
So advice I would give you is look for people at the firm who are interested in you and interested in developing you as a lawyer, and volunteer for things. Try to, if there's some matter. I mean, I know how as you said, the system here is somewhat unique, but I can't tell you how many times when I was a partner, an associate would lobby to get assigned to me or lobby to help work on something that I was working on. Even before I was a partner, I remember an incident when, going off to a long trial that was supposed to be 2 years long out of state, where an African-American associate volunteered. She wasn't on the team, but she volunteered to work on that because it was going to be real trial experience with some really good trial lawyers. And everybody else was sort of running from that case because it was so long and so out of town, and she ran for it. So things like that, build your own career. Don't assume that everything that is stated as a rule of you're assigned to a particular partner, that's the partner you're going to work for, period, that you can't do something about that, whether it's working with other people through a pro bono matter or asking for what your next rotation is going to be. And there was one instance where somebody got herself rotated into my team without my even knowing it. I'm not sure I would recommend that, but it worked out fine. And there was a second part to your question, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Given the unique training here, like how does it inform your practice today? As compared to like your peers who've grown up in different systems and different firms?
So when, I remember I came here thinking this was somewhere where in 2 or 3 years I would get the most experience possible. And Lauren didn't say this, but shortly after she came here, she was taking depositions, and then she examined witnesses at trial and cross-examined witnesses at trial when she was a second-year associate. And I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a big firm where that kind of thing can happen. And so those experiences that I had and the people working with me had, I think, I can fast forward many years, I guess, so I'm another partner and I and 2 associates are in California State Court trying a case. And on the other side of us is the head of the litigation department at a big California firm and another senior partner at that firm. And they did not know how to introduce a document into evidence. And the judge said, after they had tried and failed, if there's anybody here this is their first trial, let me know and I'll explain to you how to do this. And nobody raised their hand. Next day they came in with Witkin's California Practice Manual, and there was a page in it that had a little box that had like the steps to use to get a documented evidence. They had that page tabbed, and every time they were trying to get a documented evidence, they would look at the Witkin thing and then ask the questions. And here that would never happen. So there's firms and there's firms, and I can't authoritatively say that Cravath today is what it was, when I left 7 years ago, but I expect it's the same. The firm's 204 years old.
Judge, thank you. Tanya Blocker on the leadership team for MBBA. Thank you again for this presentation. My question is rooted in, you mentioned humility, and also you present very grounded, like you're very grounded. What do you attribute that groundedness to?
Of course, it's always hard to know where your characteristics come from, and I guess, before I had kids, I thought that nurture mattered a whole lot more than nature, but then seeing my kids, I'm sort of wondering about that. But leaving that aside, what I attribute it to really is my mom. And so I was the oldest of 3 children, and my mom was totally blind. And so from a very early age, I had to do all kinds of things for her. And there's probably nothing in my life that I enjoyed more than helping her with things. So, there were a lot of things I was not good at. For example, anything athletic or sports or whatever, it just was not part of my upbringing because what I was doing was reading things. But my uncle, many years, I was actually working here as a partner, and my uncle, who was pretty elderly then, called me up and told me a story that, of course, I wouldn't remember because I don't even remember about the shoe. But he said he was visiting when I was 2 years old. So he usually visited in the summer, so I must have been closing in on 3. And he said he went grocery shopping with me and my mom. And that I was sitting there looking at the wrong side of a soup can. And so he came over and said, no, if you want to know what kind of soup it is, you have to look at the front. And I said, I'm reading the ingredients to see what's in it. So I could, I had to read because my mom needed to be able to read and to know things like how much, what a $5 bill was and a 10 and a 15, because she could then fold them different ways and know what they were. And I would take her places. And when I was 9, I guess, she went to UC Berkeley and got a PhD between when I was 9 and 12, and I was reading her PhD coursework to her and going with her to some of her classes. And it was just, I think, having that as something that I had to do and that I loved doing that grounded me. My middle daughter at one point was going through this sort of existential crisis when she was maybe 5 years old, saying, why am I here? Why am I here? And I would keep saying to her, I don't know why you're here, but I'm here to help you.
I feel like that's a great note to, yeah. Judge, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for taking the time. Absolutely, and thank you again to Cravath and the entire team, Peter Wilson Jr., Chief Diversity Officer, for hosting us. We will leave this room and convene in the cafe area, I believe it is, to the back, where we will fellowship with the reception. And so please join us and let's continue the great conversation.
Probably need that one. Oh, okay.